So thanks for joining me this morning on the last day of the conference. My name's Chris Hopkins. I'm a consultant on the Premier Developer team at Microsoft. I don't know how many of you know about Premier Services at Microsoft, but I work on a team that provides development services to enterprises and ISVs around various technologies. So one of the areas that I specialize in is SharePoint and Office development. And I actually work really closely with the Visio product team. They call me one of their virtual technical specialists or whatever other title they come up with. But they have me come to their conferences and present on technical topics around Visio. And they have me talk to some of their customers and a lot of their partners around how to develop some interesting solutions with Visio. So today, it's mostly going to be about visualization of data within Visio and SharePoint. But I don't know how many of you have, or how deep your knowledge is on Visio and what its capabilities are, but Visio is a pretty extensible application for diagramming, right? If we have some time, some of the things that I can maybe show you or afterwards, or you can go to my blog and find out some more information, but manually generating diagrams is what most people do today with Visio. So getting in there, finding the right shapes, putting the diagram together. I'll show you some of the advanced techniques for like building drill downs and connecting to multiple data sources and that sort of thing. But all the way up to applications that generate Visio diagrams for you on the fly. That's actually, that capability's been around for a long time with Visio. But it's just now getting more and more popular, probably because of just the functionality that Visio Services provides inside of SharePoint now, right? I'm working with a lot of customers today they've got back-end systems that have data that's changing continuously. It's hard to keep up to date, keep your diagrams updated with those data changes, right? You'll see some of the benefits of using data linking and how that works in Visio, but things like, I don't know, let's say you've got, let's take a simple example like org charts, right? Those org charts are changing every day. People are coming into the organization, leaving, that sort of thing. It's a real manual process to go through those diagrams and add people, remove people, change the organization around. But what if you had a little application that would just every day produce a new version of that diagram and throw it up in your SharePoint site? And then, of course, since it's in SharePoint, you have Visio Services to display that diagram to anybody that comes along to your dashboard page. So those are the type of scenarios that you would get really into more advanced stuff, 300-400 level type stuff. We don't have time to talk about today, but like I said, I'm in the Premier organization. If you guys want to email me for more information if you hear me say something during this talk, want more information on it, feel free to send me an email and ask me about it. So my goals today are, like I said, to kind of walk through some of the techniques that I use and show you some more of the advanced features that you might not know about when you're using the Visio client to build a diagram that's eventually going to be the basis for a dashboard on your SharePoint site. And so that includes, actually one of the biggest things is really data linking. The functionality that we can use there to bring in back-end data sources into Visio, mixed data sources from multiple locations. And then we'll get into, the more advanced stuff. Web part connections, mashup API, that kind of stuff. So you got your Visio diagram in the browser. People are viewing it in the browser. That's great. What else can I do with it? So I'll kind of show you some of that stuff as well. So first, real quick, how many people are using Visio Services today? Okay, so not that many. How many have seen, who hasn't seen anything about Visio Services at all? Let's start with that. Okay, so we've got a fair number of people. Okay, so let me switch over here. I just want to jump into just some basic capabilities of the service application, right? We'll talk about some of the details of what these features do. But this is a Visio diagram that is being hosted in a document library in SharePoint. So all I did as a Visio user is I said save as. I browsed out to a document library and I threw my diagram up there, drag and drop it into the document library, any way to get that file into a document library, but it's just a Visio diagram. There's no import, export scenarios, right? Visio services renders the diagram natively from that Visio file format. So there's nothing extra that you have to do there. So this is the default view that you see. So if I was to go back to the document library, I just have a list of Excel files and Visio files and Word files, but I clicked on my Visio diagram. This is the default view that I get from Visio services. And you can see here I can pan, I can zoom in, right? I can take a look at these different shapes. I can select shapes. I know that when we get into the data linking capabilities of Visio, these shapes have data connected to them, right? Just as some of the generic functionality that I have here. Let me get that corner there. I've got a little property viewer that it's probably hard to see that on the screen. But it shows me all the data properties that are part of that shape. Right? And I'm not going to say those are all the data properties that are coming from my back-end system, because that could be a mix. There could be static properties in there. There could be properties from multiple different data sources all mixed together, all connected to that one single shape. Right? So a little bit about how this diagram was built. If I switch over to the Visio client here, so the color's a little bit different than the diagram that you were just looking at, but that's based on the data rules that I set up. And we'll talk about how those data rules or those data graphics were configured for different diagrams. We'll go through and we'll build some. But I just wanted to show you how simple this diagram is. If I drag one of these shapes over here, right, over here on the right-hand side, you can see our data properties. And again, some of these could be statically entered by the user that don't change, that aren't coming from a back-end data source. In this case, all of these happen to be populated from a data source, which you see down here on the bottom. This external data window that we have symbol, company name, etc. That's actually coming from a web service through BCS. So we have BCS configured to show us an external list in SharePoint. Right? Since it's an external list, we can connect Visio and Excel and all different types of applications to it. So we're just utilizing that as our data source into this diagram. And once that data source is in this diagram, right, we can take that and connect it to any kind of shapes we want, and then choose how we want to visualize that data on those shapes. So again, like I said, this is a very simple diagram. These are just rectangles. If I go in here and I turn off the data display, you can see I basically have a rectangle with some text in it, right? And that's the same thing I can do here. I can just say, well, let's change that. Let's bring the font up quite a ways. But you can see there's no data properties there. And again, I can come in here and I can define one. We'll call it symbol, both internal and external. Let's see. And then I can come up here and I can put something in there, right? I can even do things like, let's go insert, field, shape data, symbol, right? And now whatever value is in the static property, right, is displayed in the text of the shape. And there's all kinds of formatting options and everything you can do there, but that's just some simple, what we call smart shape capabilities in Visio. The fact that you can reference and build formulas and display properties and such in different aspects of the shape. But the real power of this comes from the data linking capabilities, right? So I could scroll through here as a user, and I could probably find the Microsoft symbol, right? And I can drag and drop this record up to that shape. And you can see some things happened automatically, right? The shape changed color. It's got some other text attributes there, which got formatted incorrectly for some reason. But we brought in all those other properties, all those other columns from that data source. And one thing that you might notice is that even though that we typed in symbol as a static property, when we data link that, Visio is smart enough to say, okay, hey, that property matches, right, a column that we have in this data set, so I'm just going to link those two up, right? And that one in this data set happens to be the primary key, But, as those properties change and that data source gets refreshed, those property values get pushed, the data in the record set gets pushed into those property values in the shape. So that's how we keep that refresh capability going inside the diagram, right? We check that data source. If we see any changes to that data source, then we have to do a little bit of logic. Hey, are there any shapes in this diagram actively using this data source? Right? If there are, let's go find the shapes and let's push those changes up into those shapes. And then things like here where you see the different colors, the icons up and down, the different text values, excuse me, those are all coming out of, let's come here, into the data graphic, or what I call the visual rules for how that shape displays that data. Right? And we can get more into that in another demo that I have, but there's a bunch of different ways to display that data, as icons, as colors, as data bars, as just however you want to format that. So that really is just, like I said, that's the bare bones basics, coming in here, creating a diagram, getting your data source, linking that data to the shapes, and then publishing that diagram up to the SharePoint site so that we get, switch back over here, so that we get this server view that people can see and is just being refreshed automatically in the background. So there's two pieces so Visio Services is a service application that's part of SharePoint Enterprise. Okay, it's not part of Foundation. Just like, a lot of the same rules apply for Excel services. If you're familiar with their service application, a lot of that applies to us as well, right? We use the same exact model. But we have those two pieces to the Visio Services side. We have the rendering capability, right, for showing any diagram that you produce in Visio, right, and any content that's in that diagram, right? So if you're importing AutoCAD images, if you're pulling clip art, office art down from the web, using native Visio or shapes, it doesn't matter. We'll render that as part of that diagram in the browser, right? If you're familiar with the Visio Services functionality that we released in the 2010 timeframe, we actually use Silverlight to render the diagrams in the browser. There's a lot of reasons why we moved to full HTML and PNG, getting rid of the Silverlight as our main engine for the rendering. One is just the third-party plugins running in browsers inside of Enterprise. A lot of that kind of stuff is disabled, not because the user doesn't want to install it, but just IT doesn't want to have those third-party add-ons installed. We render everything as PNG, and you might not be able to see it while I'm doing some of the demos. As I zoom in and out, Visio Services provides different quality of images, based on my zoom level, right? So it keeps the performance pretty high. If I'm looking at a high-level view of that diagram, the details way down inside those shapes aren't as crisp, but as I zoom in, things get a lot better. Consumers do not need any Visio client installed. They don't need a license to Visio, right? Only the people that are actually producing the Visio diagrams need a client license. Yeah, question? Does the server? No. So the only requirement for Visio Services is that you have that service application running on a web front-end server that's part of the SharePoint farm. And so you've bought SharePoint Enterprise and deployed it out to one or many web front ends. So yeah, so no client license is needed to consume these in the browser. You just need a browser that's capable of displaying SharePoint, right? So, any modern device, tablets, phones, whatever, they all work pretty well with SharePoint and with Visio Services. One of the things that we did with Visio Services in this release, obviously with like the release of the WinRT machines and people using Windows 8 phones and iPads and iPhones and stuff like this, is we went through the touch capabilities as far as Visio services is concerned, and did a lot of multi-point touch scenarios so that people that are zooming in and out, using multiple fingers and doing things with the shapes in the browser, so that all that's supported. In the past, all we did was convert touch into just mouse clicks basically, and you had some very simple scenarios for touch, select shape and pan around, and that was about it. Let's see, in Office 365, don't want to forget about that. So Visio Services is available, like I said, in in SharePoint Enterprise on-prem, but if you purchase Office 365, I think it's like E3 or E4 SKU, I can't remember what the SKU name is for that. Visio Services is part of that as well. So it's automatically provisioned for you. It's part of your Office 365 subscription, right? And that's different from the client, right? So you have SharePoint Online as part of that Office 365 tenant, right, which gives you Visio services, Excel services, all of that. But there's a client for Office and Visio that come as part of that Office 365 subscription. The Visio client itself is actually an add-on to that Office 365 license. So just be aware of that the Visio client is separate. You get Word and PowerPoint and Excel and all that stuff, but you have to add Visio onto that. But Visio Services is part of your SharePoint Online tenant. The second piece is the data refresh piece. So when we go to render a diagram, right, one of the first things that we do is we check out the diagram to see what kind of data connections are stored in that diagram. If we can contact them, etc. We go out and we run the queries, pull the data back, see if there's any changes that we need to make to the shapes. Those changes include like the insert field that I did, or the data graphics, the color values, the icons, all that stuff, right? So we have to get the data, bring that back, go and look at the shapes that are connected to that data, and then figure out what to do to those shapes, render the diagram, and serve that back to you, right? So that's the second piece, is just the data refresh part of that engine that makes those visualizations possible. Now, the big question that comes up here is, okay, well, we're refreshing data from a back-end system. What about changes to the diagram? Right? Like maybe that org chart example that I was talking about earlier. Chris left the organization, but we've got this shape, right, in the diagram. We want to get rid of that. So Visio Services doesn't allow you to make any changes to the content of the diagram. So the shape has to exist. Data that's attached to it, name, address, phone number, metric values, whatever, those are changing the way the icons and the colors and all that display. But because that record in the database goes away, data refresh is actually going to do some things to the shape. Your icon probably isn't going to render properly, or the names that you have in your text fields are going to be blanked out. But we're not going to remove the shape because that record was linked to a shape and that record no longer exists. Does that make sense? And there's also, there's no browser editing capability. So this isn't a web application. This isn't, Excel web app or Word web app, right? This is just, Excel services. So without, what you would get with Excel services without purchasing and installing the extra Office web apps application on top of it. So I showed you a little bit about the data graphics functionality. You can connect data to your shapes, and you don't have to use data graphics. You could do insert field and pick a property and just show it as text, and we're gonna update that as the data changes as well. But this functionality here allows you to make your diagram look a lot more interesting, right? And do some more complex things actually, because it doesn't say it on here. I think I have it on a different slide, but you can put special calculations and formulas into your shapes. So, for example, if you have like sales numbers that are coming from a database and you've got some inventory and stock and other things, instead of showing a data bar, just, Chris sold 37 shirts, right? You might make that a calculation based on some data coming from one or more of the other data sources that you've linked into that diagram, right? So from Visio's perspective, you can make these things, much more complex, right? Aggregate that data together and then show it as simple data bars or show it as just color changings or icons changing, that kind of stuff. Now that note at the bottom where it says build your own, so we have some ISVs, some partners that actually build some custom data graphics, company logos and that sort of thing, so that it's very easy for an end user for Visio to format this stuff. But they're nothing more than just Visio shapes. So these data bars and stuff that you see here, they're just specially formatted Visio shapes that get attached to, your org chart shape or your flow chart shape or whatever to show these different data properties change. And I'll show you some of that. That's what we used to do in 2010. We still support the data graphics. Like I said, data graphics are more meant for an end user, so they can just basically pick through a gallery and say, yeah, I want the traffic lights, or I want the up-down arrows, etc. But in 2013, some of our partners and such that build more complex visualizations of Visio said, hey, we want all your shapes to render dynamically based on data. Because what we did in 2010, when we went to render a diagram in the browsers, we said, okay, well, we're just going to ignore everything in here and present it just as it was when it was saved, except for those data graphic icons and the text labels and that sort of stuff. Everything else is just going to be generic and presented to the user. Now we render everything from scratch. So the flowchart shapes, the connectors, we look at all the properties, all the formulas that make up those shapes, and we create a representation for that dynamically. Now what that allows you to do is this shape here, and I'll show you some other ones, is you can build functionality into shapes and make those shapes do things in your diagram based on data. Like a simple example would be, let's say, like the width of a shape, right? Visio says, well, you can make it 2 inches wide, or you can put a formula in there that says, well, the width of this shape is actually equal to this data property from this, SQL Server table, and as that value changes in SQL, that shape's going to get bigger and smaller. Well, when you save that to Visio Services, the same thing's going to happen, right? Just like this thermostat here, right? So we've got different sections in there that are built on top of each other, and they change in height as some data property changes. So that's not data graphics. That's just some custom Visio shape that somebody made, excuse me, that has that behavior built into it. So that extends, Visio into a lot of other areas and makes your diagrams a lot richer. But if you haven't worked with custom shapes in Visio before, it can be time-consuming and a little difficult to set that kind of stuff up. And like I said, if you've got questions about this kind of stuff, I can point you to blog articles and send you all kinds of resources on some of these things that I'm talking about here. So the process real quick, and then we'll go into a demo. So we've got our Visio diagram. We bring our data record set into the diagram, all right, through one of the wizards that we provide. I keep saying this, but multiple data record sets are supported within one diagram. I've actually got a customer, one of the customers that I'm working with, that generates diagrams automatically from code, from data in the backend system. They're bringing in, when they generate their diagram, they end up with about 160 different queries, different data record sets in one Visio diagram, right? And then they mash all that stuff up together and link it to shapes, and all that stuff's automated before they publish it up to SharePoint. So when I say multiple data record sets, 200 and something, that's kind of out of the norm. Most people have 1 or 2, but it's very extensible. Data is cached in the diagram for portability. So that question comes up a lot for various reasons: IP, security, file size, that kind of stuff. And again, the whole reason that we do that is for portability. Visio is used a lot in offline scenarios. So people will be working for several hours putting a Visio diagram together so at their office they can run a data connection query, get the latest set of data, run home with the diagram, work on it at the airport, which I typically do, that sort of stuff. And then, of course, for people that don't have connectivity to that data source, if I was to send you a diagram I was working on, you'd basically end up with this blank diagram, that didn't have any data connection to it. You wouldn't understand what my diagram was talking about. So link records to shapes. So once we have the data record set in there, we got to figure out how to link those individual records up to the shapes in the diagram, right? And there's a couple processes for that, and I'll show you that. And then the third piece is configuring the data graphics, or if you get ambitious, going into the shapes and building your own custom shape that behaves accordingly when data is changing from your backend data source. Now this slide here I wanted to point out, just because again this is one of those things that you're not going to find information really on the internet about this. MSDN's not going to say, oh hey, you can do this with Visio services, so go in there and make a bunch of custom formulas. It's just one of those advanced techniques that I like to show people. But I mean, you can see in the screenshot there, right? What ends up happening when you link a record to a shape, like I showed in the first demo, is Visio generates properties in that shape for every single one of those columns, right? So if you're bringing in records from 2, 3, 4 different data sources, all those properties are going to be built into that shape. You can then turn around and do stuff like that where you're using the placeholders or the tokens for those properties in a formula that you put together to do some things with, right? And that formula could be used for data graphics, but it could be used for a number of other things, maybe affecting the behavior of the shape, maybe just showing, a text property on the shape that's showing that information. But people ask about, okay, well, scenarios come up about aggregating data across, they want to do reporting like, SSRS does or something like that with Visio. We're really not that tool. But if you want to get into some more advanced stuff, you can write formulas like that into your shapes and do some of these calculations yourself. The one thing I will say about that is it's a lot like Excel. So I'm sure everybody here has probably used a formula in a cell in a workbook before. So it's really not much different in Visio than it is from Excel. Let's see, number 8. All right, so what I wanted to show you next was just kind of the next step up, right? We took a simple diagram, we connected some data to it, and we published it in our document library, right? The next step is a more advanced diagram. So we've got multiple data sources. We've got some more advanced data graphics. You can see icons and data bars and text with formulas, and I'll show you these, right? And then we have drill down capability, right? What I mean by drill down capability is somebody comes here and clicks on one of these stores, and it's going to take them to a different view, right, that shows them more detail about that store. Maybe I even drill in a little bit more, and that takes me down to a more advanced view of that diagram, hopefully here in a second, that shows us more detail on what's going on in that store, right? And here there's a lot of things going on, right? Just pointing out. Here's some of those more advanced shapes. We can see these shapes actually change. They show different geometries. Different portions of the shape basically turn on and off as data properties change, right? There's text built into these shapes as well that shows up based on formulas. So these are the custom shapes that I was mentioning. And up here we've got some simple shapes that just have text being displayed into them that are coming from another data source, right? So across the top here I basically threw up some rectangles and said, hey, here's 5 rectangles. Each one of these is going to show the top 5 orders basically that are in the system, right, for our store. So how I put that together, let's just come out to this drawing here. So now we're in the Visio client. So like I said, we'll render anything that you can put in the Visio diagram. AutoCAD files, stuff from the web, office art, Visio shapes. A lot of these map shapes that you find, these happen to actually be some interesting shapes that a partner built for us. But these could be images out of clip art on the web or whatever. This diagram, one of the things I want to show here is just the fact that it's actually interesting when we go in and survey customers on what they want to see us do in Visio next, and always at the top of the list is making it easier to draw diagrams. Right? You actually be surprised when you start talking to people and finding out how difficult it is to actually, draw something. You get somebody on a whiteboard and they take their pen and they can sketch stuff out pretty quickly, erase it, start over. But you give them like a blank canvas in Visio and you give them some shapes. A lot of times they end up looking at this blank page and going, well, I know I want a process diagram, or I know I want a floor plan of my store, or what shapes am I going to use? And they start browsing on the web, and like 6 hours later, they finally find the shape they want to use and they start putting a diagram together, right? Instead of focusing on, well, let me get the diagram put together, right? And then let me go back and make it look pretty after that, right? People get really, really focused in on, it's got to look professional as soon as I start drawing, rather than let me just get my idea on paper first and go back and change it. Now, I just wanted to show this because I think it's a cool feature. I've actually been waiting for it in Visio for a long time. So I did that. I said, okay, let me just throw some squares out there and put some labels in them. These are going to be my stores, right? Once I get that structure figured out, then I go back and say, you know what? Okay, I spent some time because I got some free time, and I found a nice shape to represent these. So let me go over here to change shape, and let me just browse through here and find some of this stuff that happens to be in the stencil that I have open over here. So I can just come over there and hit change shape and bring in that nice looking shape, right? Now, this example isn't typical. Usually when I'm talking to people about this, it's like SharePoint workflow or BPMN diagrams, right? A lot of times people that aren't familiar with the syntax or the structure of those diagrams are the ones that are starting to create those and say, don't worry about the Visio shapes. Just start drawing rectangles. Send an email, right? Create a task. Do these steps in this order. Connect the shapes together, and then once you learn, or somebody else in your organization that's an expert in like SharePoint workflow, you can give them that diagram and they can go, okay, I know what Chris means. Let me just replace these with the actual actions and conditions that are in that workflow template, and then upload that to SharePoint, and away we go. So I just wanted to point that out. I think it's a feature. It's new for 2013. Nobody really talks about it, but I think it's a huge time savings there, and it really changes the way that you produce diagrams in Visio. So obviously a lot of this diagram's put together already, right? I've got a couple pages here. I've got my all stores. I've got my store detail, and I've got my store inventory. So right there you can see that's how that drill down capability that I showed you is put together. Yeah, question? Good question. So the question was, when I did that change shape operation, do all the properties and the metadata and stuff, right, stay with it, right? It's just basically a graphic replacement. And yeah, they do, right? If I was to, create some properties over here, or if that was data linked to some data source that I haven't brought in yet to my diagram and did that change shape, yes, all those properties map over to the new one. Yeah, another question. Yeah, so that's when a shape has properties, and that kind of goes along with the data linking functionality too. So if you create, this store has, address and phone number, right, that you typed into it. Let's say you did that in that rectangle, right, and then you swapped it to the store, and the store had a couple other properties plus, the address and phone number. Visio is smart enough to know that, hey, these properties already exist. And there's actually, when you get into, and we're going maybe a little too deep here, but if you look at this dialog right here, I'll just point something out to you. When I created that property earlier and I typed symbol into both of those, I kind of said my internal and external. So label is what the user sees, right? Phone number. Name is some identifier for that property and the shape, and it could be anything, right? You could name it phone number, or you could name it something special. Now, if those match up, Visio matches them up from other shapes and merges the data in. But that would be a scenario where if you had multiple properties, two phone numbers, right, from two different sources, but when they come together in Visio, you actually want phone 1 and phone 2, right? You could have that internal name different, and then those data properties would not merge. They would be two separate. So I know that's kind of takes a demonstration to show how that works, but the answer is usually yes, but in some cases, no, because if you specifically designed that to not merge in the shape. All right, so like I said, I got my detail pages here as I drill down. And drill down in Visio is nothing more than just coming in here to hyperlink, and under sub address, you can see you've got a list of pages, right? So I can say store detail, click on OK. All right, now if I hover over, it's probably hard to see, but my cursor has a little hyperlink globe symbol on it, just helping me identify that. And when I go to the browser, after I save this to SharePoint, all right, let me zoom out here. There's actually a list of pages up here by default that somebody can navigate through. But if I hover and pause, you see the little finger like you get with a normal hyperlink in the web, and it gives you a pop-up to say, hey, control click to navigate that hyperlink. So that's all drill down is. People ask about how do we do drill downs all the time. Hey, I've got this high-level diagram. I want to dive down into more detail and see it. My answer is use hyperlinks and design that detail on other pages in that diagram. So let's actually bring data in now, right? So we've got our diagram kind of laid out the way we want it. We've got our nice shapes in here. Let's go and find some data. And actually, let me come out to, let's see here. No, I don't want that. So these data sets that I have here are the data sets that we're going to use. Like I said, I've got a SQL Azure database that's connected through BCS in SharePoint. This is, I don't know if you noticed the URL, but this is SharePoint Online, right? So right here you can see Visio 15, .sharepoint.com, right? So this is standard Visio services functionality that's in the cloud. I've got a couple different external lists in SharePoint that I'm going to connect to use that data. And if I look at these, we can see, store inventory, or store sales overall, or the top 5 store orders. So you can see here, here's all my inventory and the data coming out of my SQL tables. All right. So I'm going to come back over to Visio. And you might notice that I've got SQL listed as one of the data sources, right? Now I could just directly connect my diagram straight through to SQL Azure. There's additional authentication steps that I have to do though, so it makes it a little bit more difficult. Right? But if somebody like my IT administrator or something for SharePoint has already set up those data sources as external lists, all the authentication is handled for me already through SharePoint, so I don't have to go through those extra steps. I just wanted to point out the fact that it's kind of why I did it that way, right? The other way that I did it, or the other reason I did it that way was because, Excel services can consume that data, other web parts can consume that data, right? I can search on that data. So I can actually find my inventory in SharePoint and search on it, and then I'm going to get, inventory information out of SQL, plus I'm going to get a list of diagrams that are connected to that data in Visio that are stored in that document library as well. So let me go through the list. There's my conference site. There it goes. Okay. And so there's that, and you can see it shows external there next to it. But let's do store sales overall. And I'll click on finish. And so when you data link to the diagram, the first thing that Visio does is it pops up that external data window for you. So you can come in here and figure out what it is that you want to do with those data records. Now, like I said, it's up to you to link those records to the shapes in your diagram that, set up that structure the way you want. There's a few tricks to that, right? And you can even use this to build out a diagram. Let me pick something like, let me just show you something real quick here. Convenience store. So let me select that shape in my stencil. This could be a flowchart shape or whatever. And I'm going to say, you know what? I ran that query. Actually, I'm going to need all those stores in my diagram. Drop them on the page, right? So now I'm at a point where now all I have to do is organize this stuff, right? And you can see over here we've got all the data properties attached, right? All the IDs of the store, etc. But that's just a real quick trick that I show people. You're starting from scratch. You have a database full of objects that need to be in your diagram. Maybe it's a operations manager and you got a whole bunch of servers and you need to build a diagram. Just data link to it, grab them all, throw them on the page, and then worry about organization and structure once you got all the shapes out there. All right, the other way you can do this is we've got an existing diagram, obviously, right? I can drag and drop that record right onto the shape, and Visio puts the data properties in there. Now again, the question around merging the data, if that shape already had like a city and state property, Visio would have recognized that and it would have written over the values that were static in the shape with the values coming out of the matching columns in that data source, right? So because we did that data link, that's kind of the authority there for the data. The other thing we can do is we can do a match, right? So we can say, hey, I want to automatically link everything on this page, and I want you to map the city column that's in my data source to whatever I have typed into these properties here. Now I know some of these other properties, some of these other shapes don't have properties, but I know they have text. So I'm going to say match them up with the text. You can see here everything's been linked. So if I go and look at Portland or Boise, we can see all our data properties are through there, right? So that's really helpful for very large existing diagrams. I know IT uses that a lot. They've got, diagrams of their racks or their data centers, and then they say, you know what, we've got this SCOM capability in Visio to connect to the data. Let's just bring that whole data source in and then hit that wizard button, and we automatically map everything to the data that you've imported in, right? And then, of course, you can reconcile and look through there and go, oh, well, I see that this particular server or this particular store didn't get linked up to a shape in the diagram, so let me see, is there a typo? Did the IP addresses not match during the search? What am I just completely missing that shape in the diagram? What happened? What's that?
Top left one doesn't have the city.
Oh, the text underneath it? Let me move it. Is it just, yeah, it's just hidden behind the Portland. Oh, no problem. Yeah, and that's a Z order issue in Visio, right? So the last one dropped is the one on top. So a lot of times people spend time figuring out how to order and organize those shapes the way to show the data on there. So I've got the data linked, right? The next thing that I want to do is apply a data graphic, right? Well, that was quick and easy. So how did I come up with that, right? Let me zoom in here a little bit. What I'm showing is I'm showing a couple different properties. Obviously, I'm showing the store, the number of employees, and the quantity sold, which are pretty easy. Those all come straight out of those data properties, right, just natively. But this icon up here is a little bit different, right? It is showing, let me edit that. So there's our city. There's our quantity sold, which is a data bar that shows from 0 to 300, that's how that data bar is formatted. There's all kinds of formatting options in there. for text and label and position and all that kind of stuff, color, etc., right? But that icon that's showing up there, this is where I talked about the formulas that we can enter instead of just linking to just a raw data value. Now, maybe your data source already does that, so then it's very simple, right? You have a stored procedure somewhere in SQL that's building up that data and running those calculations and returning it for you. That's fine. But what you can't do, right, in SQL is take data from your Excel workbook, data from your SharePoint list, and data from that SQL table, and then run that calculation against them, right? So in Visio, if you have data in Excel, data in SharePoint, and data in SQL, and you bring all three of those together, you can actually run a calculation across all, properties from all three of those data sets. So it really enables people to, come up with their own views and their own visualizations, right? They don't have to come to me being the SQL administrator and say, hey, you know what, this stored procedure doesn't take into account, X, Y, and Z, right? I can just come in here and say, well, you know what, I'm going to do that myself because I know that I keep that data in my personal Excel workbook that I track in my site, right, for my utilization or something like that. So I'll connect to that, merge it in with the corporate data from SQL, and do a calculation. All right, and again, we can just come in here and we can, format all of these if we wanted to, apply the data graphics to them. And then, of course, like what you were pointing out with Seattle, is there might be some formatting we need to do, right? Move some things around so that stuff isn't overlaid on each other, right? Now, if we come into our second page, our detail page, right? Obviously, we can do the same thing. We can drag and drop Seattle on there. We've got our properties. Come into data graphics, apply that data graphic. But I'm also using a feature, I'm also using a feature here that we call callouts, right? So Visio 2010 introduced this. If I move this shape over, you can see that those callouts go with it, right? And those are just positionable shapes, right, that show some kind of link to their parent, right? And I've used multiple here, as you can see, to drop those, and that's just from the insert callout, and you can see we've got a bunch of different options to choose from. But the reason that I use the callouts is because when they show that link to the shape. If I move the store, that stuff goes with it, and I can data link callouts as well because they're just Visio shapes. So I'll do link data to shapes. I'll come back to my SharePoint site, and let's do the inventory of my store. So now I've got two different data sources coming out of SQL Azure through my SharePoint site. And I can link up these, right? So I can say, hey, there's suit coat, right? There's dress pants, etc. And if I look at these, we've got properties. If I come in here and apply a data graphic, this one I'm making very simple based on the space that I have to display. You can see what I have here is I'm showing should be the quantity sold for that product in that store. Right. And again, like I said, the reason I use callouts is because, if I'm reformatting my diagram and I need to move stuff around, you can see it's very easy to do that, and the data graphics stay with it. Right. So once again, we got one more level to go down. I can edit hyperlinks. Here you can see I've already set up the Seattle store inventory hyperlink that goes down to the next page. And this one takes us down into the more complex scenario, which does not use data graphics at all. So these shapes use built-in functionality. We've always been able to do this, right? What I'm showing you here with these custom shapes changing based on data in the client isn't new. This has been around since version 1 of Visio. It's kind of the basis for how Visio works and one of the founding principles of the application. It allows people to generate really cool graphics that respond to data changes very easily. If you go back into early Visio and use some of the floor planning shapes, furniture shapes, that kind of stuff, they have control handles that you can move and shapes change and rotate and this sort of thing. Those are all controlled by these formulas. So what I've done is basically built a shape let me kind of deconstruct this a little bit over here, right? So this is basically just a group of geometries, right, overlaid on each other. So there's kind of the structure of that shape, right? So there's just some layers there, and each one of those shapes knows what to do based on some data property that I've already created inside of that shape, right? So if we look at it, this isn't data linked at all. I just went through and made sure that I have to have a quantity small, a quantity medium, etc., right? Because those properties and those values are actually formulas inside these shapes, right? And we're getting a little deep here, but basically, here's an example where this turns off everything. That formula turns off everything in the shape. Do we show it or not? Well, the fact that we show it or not is based on whether or not the quantity extra large is a certain value or not, right? If it is, it's on. If it isn't, it's off, right? I mean, that's how these shapes work, right? So if we come over here and change some of those, right, you can see how those parts of the shape just kind of disappear, right? They're still there. It's just visibility and stuff is getting turned off. And the same with colors, right? 3, 7, 9, 10, stuff like that. So all that logic, the color, the text that's getting displayed, those little parts of the shapes that hide and show, they all have formulas in them that basically say, hey, if that property is less than this, then I need to not be displayed. Otherwise, I'm displayed. Right. Now, if you go to my blog, I've got all kinds of articles on how to, build and customize shapes like that. And I guess I should have copied that shape and not deleting it. So that's fine. Let me just grab that one and put it there instead. Okay. And the same thing holds true here. I'll use the same data source, right, that I was data linking on this other page. I'm going to link it up over here, right? I can take those records and I can link them to multiple shapes in the diagram. So just because I linked a record to a shape doesn't mean I can't link it again or again or again, right? 3, 4, 800,000 different times, right? One record to many shapes, right? What you can't do is many records from the same data source into one shape, right? So I can't take, suit coat and sport jackets and link them both to that shape. It's going to say, hey, you can't do that. Are you sure you want to replace it with the existing? I'll say no. But I can come over here to overall sales and drop Seattle on that. And now I've got city, state, employees, plus all the product information, again, merged into that shape, right? So this is kind of what I was talking about with that scenario with Excel and SharePoint and SQL. I can get a record from all three of those, put them into a shape, and now I've got all that data merged together, right? Let me undo that there. So again, come through here, automatically link. I know I've got, let's see, that's interesting. Oh, whoops. Let me make that my active data source first. And then product ID. I know these shapes all have product ID in them, so that's what I'm picking here. They don't have any text typed into them or anything, so that's why I'm not. I'll hit finish. And then you can see some of the shapes change because their quantities are getting fed from that data coming in from that data source, right? And that's it.
You had to drag one row from below each item above.
So linking the records to the individual shapes?
Right.
I could do it manually for all of them.
So there was.
Yeah, if I undo that last step, right, if you look here, right, except for some that I've linked in other data sources, see everything is missing a link icon right here. So these records aren't linked to any shapes at all. And I could take sports jackets, and I don't know where that one's at over here, and I can drag and drop it onto that shape. Right? Now that link is established between that record and that shape by manually doing the drag. Right? I can also pick a shape over here in my stencil manually drag to some blank area, it drops the shape and then sets up that link. Okay? The other thing that I can do is hit the wizard, and through the wizard, I tell it, hey, I've got a property, or I've got a column in my data source called product ID. It's going to have a value in it. Go through all the shapes on the page. All those shapes that you're looking at, if they have a product ID, and if its value matches one of these values, then just automatically link it up. And that way I don't have to go and manually link each record to each one of those shapes. Right? So if I click on Finish, you can see they all got a link, and some of them changed there. Right?
You have to set the product ID on each individual shape.
So what I had done to set up this demo is, yes, I had a product ID property already built into that shape, but based on, if I just come over here and say, hey, I'm going to lay out this store, let me draw a couple shapes. I know this one's going to be suit coat, and this one's going to be dress pants, right? So I just type text into there. Now, if I come in here and say automatically link, I'll have to say, well, it's not product ID, it's actually product description, and those shapes don't have properties, but I know they have text. So why don't you try to match up the text, to some of these properties here. And so when I click on Finish, now if we look, we've got those properties from the records when I select those. Right? And there's no data graphics being applied. We're not using data graphics on this page. I don't think any of these, I guess those ones make sense because it's using a data bar, right? So it shows the quantity sold for those products. But yeah, so that's, like I said, that's where you get into, hey, just start drawing rectangles out there, type in text, get the structure of your diagram put together quickly, then go back and figure out, how do I make it look nice, right? How do I organize things so that it makes more sense, right, to somebody that's going to consume it in the browser. So now that this diagram's done, we've got about 15 minutes left, and I got a bunch more stuff I want to show you. Now that this diagram's done, right, like I said, we just go File, Save As, pick SharePoint, browse out to our document library, and put it up there, right? And then we come up with, where'd that view go? Let's go there. And then we come up with this experience where they browse through, they find the diagram, right? They can click on it, navigate through. Oops, there it goes. And then see all the detail. And again, every time when you see that refreshing logo there, it's hitting the data sources, doing the refresh, rendering all those shapes, bringing that diagram back and showing it in the browser, right? I guess I didn't show how I set these up, but again, it was the same way. It was just another data source, go through the data linking capabilities, link into that top 5 orders. If I was to go back and show you that, because this is where, let me scroll back here, top 5 store orders. This is actually something good to point out because Visio doesn't have any pivoting technology or any filtering technology, right? You can run, when you do your data linking wizard, you can say, hey, give me that table, or give me that view, or give me that stored procedure. That's it, right? In Visio, you're not writing your own query. You're not going to say, well, give me all these orders, but only give me the top 5 or the top 10 orders, right? Visio is not going to do that. So you've got to figure out how to set that scenario up in your data source by creating a view or a stored procedure or something like that. Also, Visio does the data linking based on some unique value, right? So a lot of times, like in this case here, I've got a table full of orders that somebody has placed against my store, right? Each order has an order ID. Okay, great, I've got a primary key. But what I can't do is link shapes. Let's go back to, well, that's in the web view. What I can't do is link shapes to a record and specify like a different value for the primary key. Because when Visio does a refresh of this data, let's say that top 5 query, right? Every time we run it, we're probably going to get different order IDs, right? So because of the way Visio works and a data record is linked to a shape, that data record might not exist anymore the next time that query runs, right? Because that order ID is now number 10, so it doesn't show up in the top 5 anymore, right? So order ID 151, the bottom one there, is going to be the next one to bump off the list. Well, a technique that I use is I set up 5 records, right? They have primary keys 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And my data source fills in, my stored procedure fills in the other data, right? So I always have 5 records. Those 5 records are always linked to the 5 shapes in my diagram, right? So that schema is never going to get broken. And then when the stored procedure runs, it fills in the data for, the rest of those records. So it fills in order ID and submitted date and all these things, right? Based on that top 5 query. But what I'm linking to in Visio, way off to the right there that you see is order rank 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right? Those are my 5 records, and those are my 5 primary keys. And those never go away. Because if a record is linked into Visio and that record goes away in the data source, when you view that diagram in the browser, Visio will actually tell you, hey, I can't refresh the data because the data structure's changed. You're missing, a primary key, or you're missing a column. If you deleted a column, it was linked to the shape. Now it's not, so then we don't know what the schema is anymore. Yeah, question?
So if we wanted a link to, say, have that same look at that drill down for, say, storage,
Uh-huh.
would you still, do you have to have a separate page for store queue, or can you just link it back to that same, say that we're looking at star 1,
Mm-hmm.
and just say, okay, now I'm looking at star 2, somehow pass that drill down?
Yeah, so the question was, if I wanted to create, all I'm showing here is just the detail for store 1. If I wanted to have 3, 4, 5 different stores that I'm drilling down into detail on, I would create multiple pages for each one of those. And the reason is because the shape has a link, right, basically hard-coded into the shape to say, hey, I'm linked to data source 4, record 300, right? And so dynamically, server side, you can't change that. What I would like to see is I would like to be able to see a day where you take that single page and put it up there and say, well, the data source is actually this one. It's Portland, not Seattle, right? And we just render, because it's really just, I could write some code right now, some quick code to go and change that in the file, and it would work just fine, but we don't dynamically do that on the server. Lay out multiple stores. Yeah. Yeah, because what basically what you're asking for is pivot, right? You just, now I want to see Portland, now I want to see Seattle, now I want to see Boise, etc. And I think we could do it easy enough. Hopefully that's on my wish list that I tell the product team is, hey, why can't we just dynamically swap that out, right? Because it's just a connection string from our side. So, but today you can't do that, and today I would create multiple pages. Or I would create multiple diagrams, right? Here's my Seattle diagram, here's my Portland diagram. Because one of the things that you can do is tell Visio Services what diagram to open and what page to open, right? So that's one of the things you can do there. So this is more advanced stuff that I want to talk about. This is showing a dashboard page. So we've taken it to the next step, right? Probably the final step from my perspective for this demo anyways, which is now let's integrate that Visio diagram with more stuff, right? We've got stuff in Excel, we've got other Visio diagrams, we've got data on the web that we want to see that's not linked into that diagram. What else can we do with Visio Services? And we'll just kind of take a tour through this dashboard here, because again, you can see I've got this web part up here, and my Visio diagram's here, so I got the same capabilities, right? I can select shapes. But if you notice what's happening, right, as I hover over these other shapes, right, I'm loading org chart diagrams that I've created in Visio down below. I'm also showing some charts in Excel services for sales and such as I hover over these different shapes here. Actually, is the Excel services one working? Doesn't look like it. But it should be changing to a different chart. So, and then over here on the right-hand side, I've got a real simple web part that's just showing HTML, just to show off the fact that, you know, through JavaScript, when you're hovering or clicking on shapes or doing that kind of stuff, we detect that, and you can write code to do things with that. And a popular scenario is, hey, maybe we've got an ASPX application over there. It's connected to some other back-end system. All we have to do is say, oh, store ID is 4. Well, let's send that over to that application in that other pane, and that application will take that store ID 4 and go do something with it. Maybe it brings back, you know, more information that we don't have linked into the Visio diagram or showing us different views, right? But the fact that we have all this stuff linked in, right, and as we hover over that dashboard, and again, like I said, you know, this is the same diagram, so I can drill down, right? See the same data over there again. I can drill. What's that? That top one is just the Visio Services web part. Nope. Nope. Yep, it's in 2010 as well. Yep. And really, I mean, that question, our capabilities here for the web part, they really haven't changed between 2010 and 2013. So if you are using 2010 today, you can prototype the same sort of stuff that you're seeing here with 2010. Data source changes, the custom shapes that I was showing you, those won't render in 2010. So there's some subtle changes, but the web part and the API itself are pretty much the same. I guess we're running short on time there. Is that supposed to beep? I guess. So let me zoom in here because there's another thing I want to show you that I think is pretty interesting with the API. I can display whatever I want dynamically on top of those shapes as well, right? So this is a web part. That Visio web part is rendering the diagram using HTML and PNG. So what that allows me to do is, because their API tells me, hey, you're hovering over this shape right now and it's located at this position in the web part, I can take some HTML. That's an HTML5 canvas that I've written text on based on the properties that that shape has. And I said, oh, well, just inject that HTML canvas right there in that diagram and have it display this information. And so I've got customers that, you know, it's HTML5 canvas. They're doing like animations and some cool stuff. I'm not a web artist, so, you know, I stick to text and colors. But I've seen people do all kinds of stuff with that because you can put controls in there. What's a good example of that? If we come over to, let's see, before that's over, I just want to show you a better example of that if I can. Conference. Let's see, supply chain, I think, has it in there. So this is another one that I demo a lot. This is actually an example of a diagram that a customer is producing from code on their back-end data. So every day the boss comes in, he goes to the SharePoint site and he goes, oh, that's what our supply chain looks like today. Because it might have changed, right? They might move, you know, distribution warehouse to some other city or something like that. But, you know, if we hover over this stuff, you can see we're getting more detailed information about the information. Again, that's just HTML. You can put buttons on there, animations, do all different kinds of things. So you can really make that interactive. So we've really gone through the 3 steps of taking that simple Visio diagram and publishing it in the web just so people can see it. And that, you know, that's for any Visio diagram. Could be just, hey, this is the way that our expense process has been for the last 20 years, right? A very static diagram, all the way up to, you know, this example here, which is there's some service running on a machine, building these diagrams, putting them in the document library, and then we're navigating it and viewing it through the web part with some custom JavaScript and HTML. So with that, let's flip over to the slides because I haven't gone through many of them. So we talked about that. A lot of these are just reviews, so I'm going to skip through them very quickly. SharePoint, Excel services, BCS, SQL, Azure. The only one that's not on that list, let's go back for a minute. Oh, it's, well, custom. Yeah, so custom.net, right? So if you can't get any of these external data sources to work, you can write your own code in .NET and make your own data provider for Visio services, right? So, you know, if you've got some proprietary system, you could write a .NET data provider for Visio and say, okay, well, there's my system. This is how we gather the data. At the end of the day, you're just returning a data record set, a .NET data record set to Visio. So very customizable, very extensible. Some rules about Excel services. It needs to be in the document library. You can't have it on network shares. All that stuff kind of has to be contained within the SharePoint site itself. We refresh directly from the content in the workbook, because if you look at the way that the data connection works, it's a select star from range, and we use this driver, and the data source is, you know, Chris's my site document library, etc. .xlsx, right? So what won't happen is a push. So if you have Excel connected to SQL, and then you connect Visio to Excel thinking that, oh, we're going to communicate and the data is going to get refreshed all the way through, it's not going to happen that way. You can get it to work that way if you use Power Pivot in the Power Pivot gallery, though, right? So if you connect your Excel workbook to Power Pivot, right, and then you put that Excel workbook in the Power Pivot gallery, you can schedule a refresh. Say, hey, refresh this workbook every 5 minutes. And then, because we read directly from the content that's in the workbook, somebody has to be writing new data to that workbook for us to refresh it. So if it's in the workbook, we'll read it. If it's not in the workbook, we won't, basically. Native lists and external lists using BCS. So BCS is new. If you had 2010, I wrote one of those custom data adapters for BCS back in 2010. So you can still do some of that stuff I was showing you through BCS, but you're going to have to install some code that I wrote in order to make that work. And it's freely available if you look on my blog, or I think it's on MSDN, the download is. Let's see, best practices for, oh, that's BCS. SQL and SQL Azure, I kind of talked about that already. I typically use BCS in SharePoint to link to my SQL Azure data, because then I just set up my authentication once and I can create as many diagrams as I want after that. Right? If you link your diagram directly to SQL Azure, you're going to have to set up authentication through Secure Store Service every single time, right? So those credentials can be mapped and passed through. Yeah, question? The workbook. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, so that would pertain to like Excel workbooks through Excel services. So if you had Farm A and Farm B, and you put all your Excel workbooks on Farm B for whatever reason, and all your Visio diagrams on Farm A, you're not going to be able to data connect across the farms. But sites and site collections on the same farm, that's fine. Yeah, because they still use the same service application in that farm to do the data refresh and the rendering.
But the users would have to have the permissions.
To that site, yeah.
Both the data source
And the Visio diagram.
the diagram.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, in your scenario, if you had, you know, the HR site and the development site, and I have a Visio diagram, and it's connected to data in HR, I don't have permissions to HR, so the data refresh is not going to work for me. Right? So, yeah, question?
On the data refresh, you said that the data refreshing is like literally real-time rendering on the, so like we're on the portal, and all of a sudden, so 10 more addresses, is it going to immediately update on that kind of portal page, or
So,
reload the page to see the data?
So yeah, so there's different options for that. For the rendering being, real time being fairly relative, right? I mean, you got to hit the diagram has to make a query, the query has to come back, we have to generate the diagram. The native experience, when you just have a diagram in the document library and you click on it, right? That page load happens, Visio Services figures all that out and brings it back, right? If you want the query to happen again, you have to refresh that page, right? If you set up a web part page like I had, the web part has a property where you tell it how often to refresh the diagram, right? So it could be 10 minutes, it could be 1 minute, right? But when you're just using that default view, there's actually a refresh button up in the top left corner for the Visio diagram that you can hit, or you just hit page reload, and then we pull that data back.
You don't set it anywhere in the
No.
So if you were even working on the workload stuff, say refresh data.
Yeah. If it's that, and like I said, if you put it in a web part, you can set the refresh down to like a minute, I think, is the smallest we will go. Except you can do some JavaScript to make it faster. So through the web UI, we provide a refresh interval, and it's 0 to, 100 or something, whatever, 0 to 60 probably, because it's by minute. But if you write some JavaScript, you can actually refresh it as often as you want to. So, all right. We're pretty much, are we out of time? Yep, we're out of time. But the web part, this deck's available, like I said. That's the stuff that we did already. So, like I said, I kind of got ahead of myself, and there's a bunch of slides here just kind of talking about, other integration opportunities. This one's kind of talking about Power View because people want to know the difference between, well, should I use Visio or should I use Power View or should I use Power Pivot or should I use SQL services, SQL reporting services, these different things. I think what I was able to show you today with the power of Visio kind of gives you an idea about, when you can use certain technologies, right? I mean, in Power View, you're not going to go in and draw your own clothing racks and make them change and do that kind of stuff, right? So if that's the kind of functionality you want, Visio is probably the use case. But if you're doing a lot of pivoting, right, Visio might not be the use case depending on how many, if you've got 400 pivots, I wouldn't want to create 400, different diagrams for each one of those pivots. So it just kind of depends on that stuff. Data sources, again, SAP, Dynamics, web services, BCS, all this stuff. You can control Visio and Visio services through PowerShell or through .NET, or, there's a lot of stuff there. So I'll stick around for a little bit while I pack up. If you guys have other questions, or I didn't give you my contact information. But right down here, this bottom link is my blog, and my email address and stuff's on there as well. So you can contact me through my blog there. All right, well, thank you guys for coming. Have a good rest of the conference.